Hello everyone. Hope you had a really good weekend. I had an amazing weekend. The weather has been brilliant. I had lots of outside time. Went to Russian lakes and just kind of walked around. So yeah, drop in the comments what you did over the weekend, if you did anything good, even if it's just a walk. Um, and yeah, so welcome to story time. My name's Georgia, and I am a conversation starter at the Yard. And we are reading Six of Crows, which is a book by Lee Bardugo, who is a #1 New York Times best-selling author, and she is also the creator of the Shadow and Bone series, which is recently come to Netflix and has been like quite a big success, I think. So if you like this book, definitely check it out. Check out her other books. And yeah, so chapter 2 is called Inej. Kaz Brecker didn't need a reason. Those were the words whispered on the streets of Ketterdam, in the taverns and coffee houses, in the dark and bleeding alleys of the pleasure district known as the Barrel. The boy they called Dirty Hands didn't need a reason any more than he needed permission to break a leg, sever an alliance, or change a man's fortunes with the turn of a card. Of course they were wrong, Inej considered as she crossed the bridge over the black waters of the Bjørskanal to the deserted main square that fronted the exchange. Every act of violence was deliberate, and every favour came with enough strings attached to stage a puppet show. Kaz always had his reasons. Inej could just never be sure they were good ones, especially tonight. Inej checked her knives, silently reciting their names, as she always did when she thought there might be trouble. It was a practical habit, but a comfort too. The blades were her companions. She liked knowing they were ready for whatever the night might bring. She saw Kaz and the others gathered near the great stone arch that marked the eastern entrance to the exchange. 3 words had been carved into the rock above them: Engent, Vorhent, Ambent. Industry, integrity, prosperity. She kept close to the shuttered shop fronts that lined the square, avoiding the pockets of flickering gaslight cast by the street lamps. As she moved, she inventoried the crew Kaz had brought with him: Dirks, Rotti, Muzzin, and Keeg, Anika and Pim, and his chosen seconds for tonight's parlay, Jesper and Big Bolliger. They jostled and bumped each other, laughing, stamping their feet against the cold snap that had surprised the city this week, the last gasp of winter before spring began in earnest. They were all bruisers and brawlers, culled from the younger members of the dregs, the people that Kaz trusted most. Inej noted the glint of knives tucked into their belts, lead pipes, weighted chains, axe handles studded with rusty nails, and here and there the oily gleam of a gun barrel. She slipped silently into their ranks, scanning the shadows near the exchange for signs of the black-tipped spies. 3 ships, Jesper was saying. The Shoe sent them. They were just sitting in the first harbour, cannons out, red flags flying, stuffed to the sails with gold. Big Bolliger gave a low whistle. I would have liked to see that. Would have liked to steal that, replied Jesper. Half the merchant council were there, flapping and squawking, trying to figure out what to do. Don't they want the Shoe paying their debts? Big Bolliger asked. Kaz shook his head, dark hair glinting in the lamplight. He was a collection of hard lines and tailored edges. Sharp jaw, lean build, wool coat snug across his shoulders. Yes and no, he said in his rock salt rasp. It's always good to have a country in debt to you. Makes for friendlier negotiations. Maybe the Shoe were done being friendly, said Jasper. They didn't have to send all that treasure at once. You think they stuck that trade ambassador? Kaz's eyes found Inej unerringly in the crowd. Ketterdam had been buzzing about the assassination of the ambassador for weeks. He had nearly destroyed Kirch-Zemeni relations and sent the merchant council into an uproar. The Zemeni blamed the Kirch. The Kirch suspected the Shoe. Kaz didn't care who was responsible. The murder fascinated him because he couldn't figure out how it had been accomplished. in one of the busiest corridors of the Stag Hall, in full view of more than a dozen government officials, the Zemni trade ambassador had stepped into a washroom. No one else had entered or left, but when his aide knocked on the door a few minutes later, there had been no answer. When they'd broken down the door, they found the ambassador face down on the white tiles, a knife in his back, the tap still running. Kaz had sent Inej to investigate the premises after hours. The washroom had no other entrance, no windows or vents, and even Inej hadn't mastered the art of squeezing herself through the plumbing. Yet the Zemni ambassador was dead. Kaz hated a puzzle he couldn't solve, and he and Inej had concocted 100 theories to account for the murder, none of which satisfied. But they had more pressing problems tonight. She saw him signal to Jesper and Big Bolliger to divest themselves of weapons. Street law dictated that for a parlay of this kind, each lieutenant be seconded by 2 of his foot soldiers, and they all be unarmed. Parlay. The word felt like a deception, strangely prim and antique. No matter what street law decreed, this night smelled like violence. Go on, give those guns over, Derek said to Jesper. With a great sigh, Jesper removed the gun belts at his hips. She had to admit he looked less himself without them. The Zemni sharpshooter was long-limbed, brown-skinned, constantly in motion. He pressed his lips to the pole handles of his prized revolvers, bestowing each with a mournful kiss. Take good care of my babies, Jesper said as he handed them over to Dirks. If I see a single scratch or nick on those, I'll spell forgive me on your chest in bullet holes. You wouldn't waste the ammo. And he'd be halfway dead through forgive, Big Bolliger said as he dropped a hatchet, a switchblade, and his preferred weapon. A thick chain weighted with a heavy padlock into Rotty's expectant hands. Jesper rolled his eyes. It's about sending a message. What's the point of a dead guy with Forge written on his chest? Compromise, Kaz said. I'm sorry, does the trick and uses fewer bullets. Dirks laughed, but Inej noted that he cradled Jesper's revolvers very gently. What about that? Jesper asked, gesturing to Kaz's walking stick. Kaz's laugh was low and humorless. Who'd deny poor cripple his cane? If the cripple is you, then any man with sense. Then it's a good thing we're meeting Gills. Kaz drew a watch from his vest pocket. It's almost midnight. Inej turned her gaze to the exchange. It was little more than a rectangular courtyard surrounded by warehouses and shipping offices. But during the day, it was the very heart of Ketterdam, bustling with wealthy merchants buying and selling shares in the trade voyages that passed through the city's ports. Now it was nearly 12 bells, and the exchange was deserted but for the guards who patrolled the perimeter and the rooftop. They'd been bribed to look the other way during tonight's parlay. The exchange was one of the few remaining parts of the city that hadn't been divvied up and claimed in the ceaseless skirmishes between Ketterdam's rival gangs. It was supposed to be neutral territory, but it didn't feel neutral to Inej. It felt like the hush of the woods before the snare yanks tight and the rabbits start to scream. It felt like a trap. This is a mistake, she said. Big Bolliger started. He hadn't known she was standing there. Inej heard the name the dregs preferred for her whispered among their ranks. The Wraith. Gills is up to something. Of course he is, said Kaz. His voice had the rough, abraded texture of stone against stone. Inej had always wondered if he'd sounded that way as a little boy, if he'd ever been a little boy. Then why come here tonight? Because this is the way Per Haskell wants it. Old man, old ways, Inej thought but didn't say, and she suspected the other dregs were thinking the same thing. He's going to get us all killed, she said. Jesper stretched his long arms overhead and grinned, his teeth white against his dark skin. He had yet to give up his rifle, and the silhouette of it across his back made him resemble a gawky, long-limbed bird. Statistically, he'll probably only get some of us killed. It's not something to joke about, she replied. The look Kaz cast her was amused. She knew how she sounded, stern, fussy, like an old crone making dire pronouncements from her porch. She didn't like it, but she also knew she was right. Besides, old women must know something, or they wouldn't live to gather wrinkles or yell from their front steps. Jasper isn't making a joke, Inej, said Kaz. He's figuring the odds. Big Bollinger cracked his huge knuckles. Well, I've got lager and a skillet of eggs waiting for me at the Cooper room, so I can't be the one to die tonight. Care to place a wager? Jasper asked. I'm not going to bet on my own death. Kaz flicked his hat onto his head and ran his gloved fingers along the brim in a quick salute. Why not, Bollinger? We do it every day. He was right. Inez's debt to Per Haskell meant that she gambled her life every time she took on a new job or assignment, every time she left her room at the Slat. Tonight was no different. Kaz struck his walking stick against the cobblestones as the bells from the Church of Barter began to chime. The group fell silent. The time for talk was done. Gills isn't smart, but he's bright enough to be trouble, said Kaz. No matter what you hear, you don't join the fray unless I give the command. Stay sharp. Then he gave Inej a brief nod and stay hidden. No mourners, Jasper said as he tossed his rifle to Rotty. No funerals, the rest of the dregs murmured in reply. Among them, it passed for good luck. Before Inej could melt into the shadows, Kaz tapped her arm with his crow's head cane. Keep a watch on the rooftop guards. Gills might have them in his pocket. Then Inej began, but Kaz was already gone. Inej threw up her hands in frustration. She had 100 questions, but as usual, Kaz was keeping a stranglehold on answers. She jogged towards the canal-facing wall of the exchange. Only the lieutenants and their seconds were allowed to enter during the parlay. But just in case the black tips got any ideas, the other dregs would be waiting outside the eastern arch with weapons at the ready. She knew Gills would have his crew of heavily armoured black tips gathered at the western entrance. Inej would find her own way in. The rules of fair play among the gangs were from Per Haskell's time. Besides, she was the Wraith. The only law that applied to her was gravity, and Sundays she defied that too. The lower level of the exchange was dedicated to the windowless warehouses, so Inej located a drain pipe to shimmy up. Something made her hesitate before she wrapped her hand around it. She drew a bone light from her pocket and gave it a shake, casting a pale green glow over the pipe. It was slick with oil. She followed the wall, seeking another option, and found a stone cornice bearing a statue of Kirch's 3 flying fishes within reach. She stood on her toes and tentatively felt along the top of the cornice. It had been covered in ground glass. I am expected, she thought with a grim pleasure. She joined up with the dregs less than 2 years ago, just days after her 15th birthday. It had been a matter of survival, but it gratified her to know that in such a short time she'd become someone to take precautions against. Though, if the black tips thought tricks like this would keep the Wraith from her goal, they were sadly mistaken. She drew 2 climbing spikes in the pockets of her quilted vest and wedged one then the other between the bricks of the wall as she hoisted herself higher, her questing feet finding the smallest holes and ridges in the stone. As a child learning the high wire, she'd gone barefoot, but the streets of Kettledown were too cold and wet for that. After a few bad spills, she'd paid a Grisha fabricator working in secret out of a gin shop in the Windstrat to make her a pair of leather slippers with nubbly rubber soles. They were perfectly fitted to her feet and gripped any surface with surety. On the second story of the exchange, she hoisted herself onto a window ledge just wide enough to perch on. Kaz had done his best to teach her, but she didn't quite have his way with breaking and entering, and it took her a few tries to finesse the lock. Finally, she heard a satisfying click, and the window swung open on a deserted office, its walls covered in maps marked with trade routes, and chalkboards listing share prices and the names of ships. She ducked inside, refastened the latch, and picked her way past the empty desks with their neat stacks of orders and tallies. She crossed to a slender set of doors and stepped onto a balcony that overlooked the central courtyard of the exchange. Each of the shipping offices had one. From here, callers announced new voyages and arrivals of inventory, or hung the black flag that indicated that a ship had been lost at sea with all of its cargo. The floor of the exchange would erupt into a flurry of trades. Runners would spread the word throughout the city, and the price of goods, futures, and shares in outgoing voyages would rise or fall. But tonight, all was silent. A wind came in off the harbour, bringing the smell of the sea, ruffling the stray hairs that had escaped the braided coil at the nape of Inez's neck. Down in the square, she saw the sway of lamplight and heard the thump of Kaz's cane on the stones as he and his seconds made their way across the square. On the opposite side, she glimpsed another set of lanterns heading towards them. The black tips had arrived. Inez raised her hood. She pulled herself onto the railing and leaped soundlessly to the neighbouring balcony, then the next, tracking Kaz and the others around the square, staying as close as she could. His dark coat rippled in the salt breeze, his limp more pronounced tonight, as it always was when the weather turned cold. She could hear Jasper keeping up a lively stream of conversation, and Big Bolger's low, rumbling chuckle. As she drew nearer to the other side of the square, Inez saw that Gills had chosen to bring Elzinger and Uman, exactly as she had predicted. Inez knew the strengths and weaknesses of every member of the Black Tips, not to mention Harley's Pointers, the Liddles, the Razor Girls, the Dine Lions, and every other gang working the streets of Kestam. It was her job to know that Gills trusted Elzinger because they had come up through the ranks of the Black Tips together, and because Elzinger was built like a stack of boulders, nearly 7 feet tall, dense with muscle, his wide, mashed-in face jammed low on a neck, thick as a pylon. She was suddenly glad Big Bolger was with Kaz. That Kaz had chosen Jesper to be one of his seconds was no surprise. Twitchy as Jesper was, with or without his revolvers, he was at his best in a fight, and she knew he'd do anything for Kaz. She'd been less sure when Kaz had insisted on Big Bolger as well. Big Bol was a bouncer at the Crow Club, perfectly suited to tossing out drunks and wasters, but too heavy on his feet to be much use when it came to a real tussle. Still, at least he was tall enough to look Elzinger in the eye. Inez didn't want to think too much on Gil's other second. Uman made her nervous. He wasn't as physically intimidating as Elzinger. In fact, Uman was made like a scarecrow, not scrawny, but as if beneath his clothes his body had been put together at wrong angles. Word was, he'd once crushed a man's skull with his bare hands, wiped his palms clean on his shirt front, and kept right on drinking. Inez tried to quiet the unease rolling around her, and listened as Gills and Kaz made the small talk in the square, while their seconds patted each of them down to make sure no one was carrying. "Naughty," Jesper said as he removed a tiny knife from Elzinger's sleeve and tossed it across the square. "Clear," declared Big Bolger as he finished patting down Gills and moved on to Uman. Kaz and Gills discussed the weather, the suspicion that the Cooper Run was serving watered-down drinks now that the rent had been raised, dancing around the real reason they'd come here tonight. In theory, they would chat, make their apologies, agree to respect the boundaries of the Fifth Harbour, then head out to find a drink together. At least that's what Per Haskell had insisted. But what does Per Haskell know? Inez thought, as she looked for the guards patrolling the roof above, trying to pick out their shapes in the dark. Haskell ran the dregs, but these days he preferred to sit in the warmth of his room, drinking lukewarm lager, building model ships, and telling long stories of his exploits to anyone who would listen. He seemed to think territory wars could be settled as they once had been, with a short scuffle and a friendly handshake. But every one of Inez's senses told her that this was not how this was going to play out. Her father would have said the shadows were about their own business tonight. Something bad was going to happen here. Kaz stood with both gloved hands rested on the carved crow's head of his cane. He looked totally at ease, his narrow face obscured by the brim of his hat. Most gang members in the barrel loved flash, gaudy waistcoats, watch fobs studded with false gems, trousers in every print and pattern imaginable. Kaz was the exception, the picture of restraint, his dark vest and trousers simply cut and tailored along severe lines. At first, she'd thought it was a matter of taste, but she'd come to understand that it was a joke he played on the upstanding merchants. He enjoyed looking like one of them. I'm a businessman, he told her. No more, no less. You're a thief, Kaz. Isn't that what I just said? Now he looked like some kind of a priest come to preach to a group of circus performers. A young priest, she thought, with another pang of unease. Kaz had called Giles old and washed up, but he certainly didn't seem that way tonight. The black-tipped lieutenant might have wrinkles creasing the corners of his eyes and burgeoning jowls beneath his sideburns, but he looked confident, experienced. Next to him, Kaz looked, 17. Let's be fair, yeah. All we want is a bit more scrub, Gill said, tapping the mirrored buttons of his lime green waistcoat. It's not fair for you to cull every spend-happy tourist stepping off a pleasure boat at Fifth Harbour. Fifth Harbour's ours, Gills, Kaz replied. The dregs get first crack at the pigeons who come looking for a little fun. Gills shook his head. You're a young one, Brecker, he said with an indulgent laugh. Maybe you don't understand how these things work. The harbours belong to the city, and we have as much right to them as anyone. We've all got a living to make. Technically, that was true, but Fifth Harbour had been useless and all but abandoned by the city when Kaz had taken it over. He'd had it dredged, then built out the docks and the quay, and he'd had to mortgage the Crow Club to do it. Per Haskell had railed at him and called him a fool for the expense, but eventually he'd relented. According to Kaz, the old man's exact words had been, take all that rope and hang yourself. But the endeavour had paid for itself in less than a year. Now, Fifth Harbour offered berths to merchant ships, as well as boats from all over the world carrying tourists and soldiers eager to see the sights and sample the pleasures of Ketterdam. The dregs got first try at all of them, steering them and their wallets into brothels, taverns, and gambling dens owned by the gang. Fifth Harbour made the old man very rich and cemented the dregs as real players on the barrel in a way that not even the success of the Crow Club had. But with all the profit came unwanted attention. Gills and the Black Tips had been making trouble for the dregs all year, encroaching on Fifth Harbour, picking off pigeons that weren't rightfully theirs. Fifth Harbour is ours, Kaz repeated. It isn't up for negotiation. You're cutting into our traffic from the docks, and you intercepted a shipment of Jerda that should have been docked 2 nights ago. Don't know what you're talking about. I know it comes easy, Gills, but try not to play dumb with me. Gills took a step forwards. Jesper and Big Bollinger tensed. Quit flexing, boy, Gills said. We all know the old man doesn't have the stomach for a real brawl. Kaz's laugh was dry as the rustle of dead leaves. But I'm the one at your table, Gills, and I'm not here for a taste. You want your war? I'll make sure you eat your fill. And what if you're not around, Brecker? Everyone knows that you're the spine of Haskell's operation. Snap it, and the dregs collapse. Jesper snorted. Stomach, spine. What's next, spleen? Shut it, Ooman snarled. The rules of parlay dictated that only the lieutenants could speak once negotiations had begun. Jesper mouthed sorry, and elaborately pantomimed locking his lips shut. I'm fairly sure you're threatening me, Gills, Kaz said, but I want to make certain before I decide what I'm going to do about it. Sure of yourself, aren't you, Becca? Myself and nothing else. Gills burst out laughing and elbowed Ooman. Listen to this cocky little piece of crap. Brecker, you don't even own these streets. Kids like you are fleas. A new crop of you turns up every few years to annoy your betters until a big dog decides to scratch. And let me tell you, I'm about tired of the itch. He crossed his arms, pleasure rolling off of him in smug waves. What if I told you there are 2 guards with city-issue rifles pointing at you and your boys right now? Inej's stomach dropped. Was that what Kaz had meant when he said that Gills might have guards in his pocket? Kaz glanced up at the roof. Hiring city guards to do your killing? I'd say that's an expensive proposition for a gang like the Black Tips. I'm not sure I believe your coffers could support it. Inej climbed onto the railing and launched herself from the safety of the balcony, heading for the roof. If they survived the night, she was going to kill Kaz. There were always 2 guards from the Stad Watch posted on the roof of the exchange. A free Kruger from the Dregs and the Black Tips had ensured that they wouldn't interfere with the parlay, a common enough transaction, but Gills was implying something very different. Had he managed to bribe the city guards to play sniper for him? If so, the Dregs' odds of surviving the night had just dwindled to a knife's point. Like most of the buildings in Ketterdam, the exchange had a sharply gabled roof to keep off heavy rain, so the guards patrolled the rooftop via a narrow walkway that overlooked the courtyard. Inej ignored it. It was easier going, but it would leave her too exposed. Instead, she scaled halfway up the slick roof tiles and started crawling, her body tilted at a precarious angle, moving like a spider as she kept one eye on the guard's walkway and one ear on the conversation below. Maybe Gills was bluffing, or maybe the 2 guards were hunched over the railing right now, with Kaz or Jesper or Big Bolliger in their sights. Took some doing, Gills admitted. We're a small operation right now and the city guards don't come cheap. We'll be worth it for the prize. That being me, that being you. I'm flattered. The Dregs won't last a week without you. I'd give them a month on sheer momentum. The thought rattled noisily in Inej's head. If Kaz was gone, would I stay? Or would I skip out on my debt? Take my chances with per her scales and forces? If she didn't move faster, she may well find out. Smug little slum rat, Gills laughed. I can't wait to wipe that look off your face. So do it, Kaz said. Inej risked a look down. His voice had changed, all humour gone. Should I have have them put a bullet in your good leg breaker? Where are the guards? Inej thought, picking up her pace. She raced across the steep pitch of the gable. The exchange stretched nearly half the length of a city block. There was too much territory to cover. Stop talking, Gills. Tell them to shoot. Kaz, said Jesper nervously. Go on, find your balls and give them the order. What game was Kaz playing? Had he expected this? Had he just assumed Inej would find her way to the guards in time? She glanced down again. Gills radiated anticipation. He took a deep breath, puffing out his chest. Inej's steps faltered, and she had to fight not to go sliding straight off the edge of the roof. He's going to do it. I'm going to watch Kaz die. Fire! Gills shouted. A gunshot split the air. Big Bolliger let loose a cry and crumpled to the ground. Damn it, shouted Jesper, dropping to one knee beside Bolliger and pressed his hand to the bullet wound as the big man moaned. You worthless podge, he yelled at Gills. You just violated neutral territory. Nothing to say you didn't shoot first, Gills replied. And who's going to know? None of you are walking out of here. Gil's voice sounded too high. He was trying to maintain his composure, but Inej could hear panic pulsing against his words, the startled wing beat of a frightened bird. Why? Moments before he'd been all bluster. That's when Inej saw Kaz still hadn't moved. You don't look well, Gills. I'm just fine, he said, but he wasn't. He looked pale and shaky. His eyes were darting left and right, as if searching the shadowed walkway of the roof. Are you? Kaz asked conversationally. Things aren't going quite as planned, are they? Kaz, Jesper said. Bolliger's bleeding bad. Good, Kaz said, ignoring him. Kaz, he needs a medic. Kaz spared the wounded man the barest glance. What he needs to do is stop his belly aching and be glad I didn't have Holst take him down with a headshot. Even from above, Inej saw Gills flinch. That's the guard's name, isn't it? Kaz said. Willem Holst and Bert van Daal, the 2 city guards on duty tonight, the ones you emptied the Black Tips coffers to bribe. Gills said nothing. Willem Holst, Kaz said loudly, his voice floating up to the roof, likes to gamble almost as much as Jasper does, and so your money held a lot of appeal. But Holst has much bigger problems. Let's call them urges. I won't go into detail. A secret's not like a coin. It doesn't keep its value in the spending. You'll just have to trust me when I say this one would even turn your stomach. Isn't that right, Holst? The response was another gunshot. It struck the cobblestones near Gil's feet. Gills released a shocked bleat and sprang back. This time Inej had a better chance to track the origin of the gunfire. The shot had come from somewhere near the west side of the building. If Holst was there, that meant that the other guard, Bert van Dahl, would be on the east side. Had Kaz managed to neutralise him too, or was he counting on her? She sped over the gables. Just shoot him, Holst, Gills bellowed, desperation soaring in his voice. Shoot him in the head! Gaz snorted in disgust. Do you really think that secret would die with me? Go on, Holst, he called. Put a bullet in my skull. There will be messages sprinting up to your wife and your watch captain's door before I hit the ground. No shot came. How? Gil said bitterly. How did you even know who would be on duty tonight? I had to pay through the gills to get that roster. You couldn't have outbid me. Let's say my currency carries more sway. Money is money. I trade in information, Gills. The things men do when they think no one is looking. Shame holds more value than coin ever can. He was grandstanding. Inej saw that, buying her time as she leaped over the slate shingles. Are you worried about the second guard? Good old Bert van Dahl? Kaz asked. Maybe he's up there right now, wondering what he should do. Shoot me, shoot Holst, or maybe I got to him too, and he's getting ready to blow a hole in your chest, Gills. He leaned in, as if he and Gills were sharing a secret. Why not give Van Dahl the order and find out? Gills opened and closed his mouth like a carp, then bellowed, Van Dahl! Just as Van Dahl parted his lips to answer, Inej slipped up behind him and placed a blade to his throat. She'd barely had time to pick out the shadow and slide down the roof tiles. Saints, Kaz liked to cut it close. Shh, she whispered in Van Dahl's ear. She gave him a tiny jab in the side so he could feel the point of her second dagger pressed against his kidney. Please, he whined. I like it when men beg, she said, but this isn't the time for it. Below, she could see Gil's chest rising and falling with panicked breaths. Van Dahl! He shouted again. There was rage on his face when he turned back to Kaz. Always one step ahead, aren't you? Gills, when it comes to you, I'd say I have a running start. But Gills just smiled, a tiny smile, tight and satisfied. A victor's smile. Inej realised with fresh fear. 1 second, I'm going to have a little drink. The race isn't over yet. Gills reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy black pistol. Finally, Kaz said, the big reveal. Now Jesper can stop keening over Bollinger like a wet-eyed woman. Jesper stared at the gun with stunned, furious eyes. Bollinger searched him. Oh, Big Bowl, you idiot, he groaned. Inej couldn't believe what she was saying. The guard in her arms released a tiny squeak. In her anger and surprise, she had accidentally tightened her grip. Relax, she said, easing her hold. But all saints, she wanted to put a knife through something. Big Bollinger had been the one to pat down Gills. There was no way he would have missed the pistol. He'd betrayed them. Was that why Kaz had insisted on bringing Big Bollinger here tonight? So he'd had public confirmation that Bollinger had gone over to the Black Tips. It was certainly why he'd let Holst put a bullet in Bollinger's gun. But so what? Now everyone knew Big Boll was a traitor. Kaz still had a gun pointed at his chest. Gil smirked. Kaz Brecker, the great escape artist. How are you going to wriggle your way out of this one? Going out the same way that I came in. Kaz ignored the pistol, turning his attention to the big man lying on the ground. Do you know what your problem is, Bollinger? He said, jabbing at the wound in Big Boll's stomach with the tip of his cane. That wasn't a rhetorical question. Do you know what your biggest problem is? Bollinger mewed. No. Give me a guess, Kaz hissed. Big Boll said nothing, just released another trembling whimper. All right, I'll tell you. You're lazy. I know it, everyone knows it. So I had to ask myself why my laziest bouncer was getting up early twice a week to walk 2 extra miles to Silla Fries for breakfast, especially when the eggs are so much better at the Cooperon. Big Bowl becomes an early riser. The black tips start throwing their weight around the Fifth Harbour and then intercept our biggest shipment of Jerda. It wasn't a tough connection to make. He sighed and said to Gills, "This is what happens when stupid people start making big plans, yeah?" Doesn't matter much now, does it?" replied Gills. "This gets ugly. I'm shooting from close range. Maybe your guards get me or my guys, but no way you're going to dodge this bullet." Kaz stepped onto the barrel of the gun so that it was pressed directly against his chest. "No way at all, Gills." "You think I won't do it?" "Oh, I think you'll do it gladly, with a song in your black heart. But you won't, not tonight." Gil's finger twitched on the trigger. "Kaz," Jesper said, "this whole shoot me thing is starting to concern me." Ooman didn't bother to object to Whisper mouthing off this time. One man was down. Neutral territory had been violated. The sharp tang of gunpowder already hung in the air, and along with it a question, unspoken in the quiet, as if the Reaper himself had awaited the answer. How much blood will be shed tonight? In the distance, a siren wailed. 19 burst at, Kaz said. Gills had been shifting slightly from one foot to another. Now he went very still. "That's your girl's address, isn't it, Gills?" Gills swallowed. "Don't have a girl." "Oh, yes, you do," crooned Kaz. "She's pretty too. Well, pretty enough for a fink like you. Seems sweet, you love her, don't you?" Even from the rooftop, Inej could see the sheen of sweat on Gil's waxen face. "Of course you do. No one that fine should have looked twice at a barrel scum like you. But she's different. She finds you charming. Sure sign of madness, if you ask me. The love is strange that way. Does she like to rest her pretty head on your shoulder, listen to you talk about your day?" Gills looked at Kaz as if he was finally seeing him for the first time. The boy he'd been talking to had been cocky, reckless, easily amused, but not frightening, not really. Now the monster was here, dead-eyed and unafraid. Kaz Brecker was gone, and Dirty Hands had come to see the rough work done. "She lives at 19 Burstrat," Kaz said in his gravelly rasp. "3 floors up, geraniums in the window boxes, and there are 2 dregs waiting outside her door right now. And if I don't walk out of here whole and feeling righteous, they will set that place alight from floor to rooftop. It will go up in seconds, burning from both ends, with poor Elise trapped in the middle. Her blonde hair will catch first, like the wick of a candle." "You're bluffing," said Gills, but his pistol hand was trembling. Kaz lifted his head and inhaled deeply. "Getting late now. You heard the siren. I smell the harbour on the wind. Sea and salt and maybe... Is that smoke I smell too?" There was pleasure in his voice. "Oh, saints, Kaz," Inej thought miserably. "What have you done now?" Again, Gil's finger twitched on the trigger, and Inej tensed. "I know, Gills, I know," Kaz said sympathetically. "All that planning and scheming and bribing for nothing. That's what you're thinking right now. How bad would it feel to walk home knowing what you've lost? How angry your boss is going to be when you show up empty-handed and that much poorer for it? How satisfying would it be to put a bullet in my heart? You could do it. Pull the trigger. We can all go down together. They could take our bodies out to the Reaper's barge for burning like all the paupers go. Or you could take your blow to your pride, go back to the burst rack, lay your head in your girl's lap, fall asleep still breathing, and dream of revenge. It's up to you, Gills. Do we all get to go home tonight?" Gills searched Kaz's gaze, and whatever he saw there made his shoulders sag. Inej was surprised to feel a pang of pity for him. He'd walked up to this place buoyed on bravado, a survivor, a champion of the barrel. He'd leave as another victim of Kaz Brecker. "You'll get what's coming to you someday, Brecker." "I will," said Kaz, "and if there's any justice in the world, and we'll all know how likely that is." Gills let his arms drop. The pistol hung uselessly by his side. Kaz stepped back, brushing the front of his shirt where the gun barrel had rested. "Go and tell your general to keep the black tips out of Fifth Harbour, and what we and that we expect him to make amends for the shipment of Jerda we lost, plus 5% for drawing steel on neutral ground, and 5% more for being such a spectacular bunch of arses. Then Kaz's cane swung in a sharp arc. Gil screamed as his wrist bones shattered. The gun clattered to the paving stones. "I stood down!" cried Gills, cradling his hand. "I stood down! You draw on me again, I'll break both your wrists, and you'll have to hire someone to help you to take the piss." Kaz tipped the brim of his hat up with the head of his cane. "Or maybe you can get that lovely Elise to do it for you." Kaz crouched down beside Bollinger. The big man whimpered. "Look at me, Bollinger. Assuming you don't bleed to death tonight, you have until sunset tomorrow to get out of Ketterdam. I hear you're anywhere near the city limits, and they'll find you stuffed in a keg at Silla's Fry." Then he looked at Gills. "You help Bollinger, or I find out he's running with the black tips. Don't think I won't come after you." "Please, Kaz," moaned Bollinger. "You had a home, and you put a wrecking ball through the front door, Bollinger. Don't look for sympathy from me." He rose and checked his pocket watch. "I didn't expect this to go on so long. I'd best be on my way, or poor Elise will be getting a trifle warm." Gil shook his head. "There's something wrong with you, Brecker. I don't know what you are, but you're not made right." Kaz cocked his head to one side. "You're from the suburbs, aren't you, Gills? Came to the city to try your luck?" He smoothed his lapel with one gloved hand. "Well, I'm the kind of bastard they only manufacture in the barrel." Despite the loaded gun at the black tip's feet, Kaz turned his back on them and limped across the cobblestones towards the eastern arch. Jesper squatted down next to Bollinger and gave him a gentle pat on the cheek. "Idiot," he said sadly, and followed Kaz out of the exchange. From the roof, Inej continued to watch as Uman picked up and holstered Gil's guns, and the black tips said a few quiet words to each other. "Don't leave," Big Bollinger begged. "Don't leave me." He tried to cling on to the cuff of Gil's trousers. Gil shook him off. They left him curled on his side, leaking blood onto the cobblestones. Inej plucked Van Daal's rifle from his hands before she released him. "Go home," she told the guard. He cast a single terrified glance over his shoulder and sprinted off down the walkway. Far below, Big Boller started trying to drag himself across the floor of the exchange. He might be stupid enough to cross Kaz Brecker, but he'd survived this long in the barrel, and that took will. He might make it. "Help him," a voice inside her said. Until a few moments ago, he'd been a brother in arms. It seemed wrong to leave him alone. She could go to him, offer to put him out of his misery quickly, hold his hand as he passed. She could fetch a medic to save him. Instead, she spoke a quick prayer in the language of her saints and began the steep climb down the outer wall. Inej pitied the boy who might die alone with no one to comfort him in his last hours, or who might live and spend his life as an exile. But the night's work wasn't over yet, and the Wraith didn't have time for traitors. So that was chapter 2 of 6 of Crows. The next chapter is called Kaz, so that'll be probably focused on the young man that we've just seen here in the harbour. If you enjoyed it, please give us a like, please comment below, and we will see you again next week.